Hello, Hamish Patel here. Wanting to talk to you about the LVR restrictions which are gone. Does that mean we can all buy with no deposit? No, it doesn't. What it means, which I'll get into right now, is that things are going to change a little bit, right? But not as much as some people seem to think. So obviously right now, if you had a less than 20% deposit and you wanted to buy your first home, it's a bit restricted. You're buying an investment property with a 10% deposit, forget about it. Now, all these things were kind of new. It came about when? About 5-6 years ago, about 4 years ago, I think. End of 2016, the big rules came out for investors in terms of needing a 40% deposit. So, what does it mean now? Well, we've got to kind of go back in time and think about how banks were lending before these restrictions. And from memory, it used to be 20% across the board, so 20% investments or your home owner occupied, it was okay. If you only had one property, right? So if you had only the first home, it was generally about 5 to 10% deposit was what was required, right? However, if you had less than 20%, right, the rules were a bit tougher. So it was the 3 C's of lending, which is basically character, cash flow, collateral. So if you were weak on collateral, which is a deposit, these two would have to show a bit more strength, right? So that's how lending has always kind of been. Now we're going to see a little bit more flexibility in the banks being able to judge what they deem, what kind of risks they want to take, right? So now if we go back in time and look at the property market, this is around when the 40% rule came in for investors, and this grey line here is basically the share of the market that investors were taking. So that took a big hit, obviously, from that time onwards, right? The first home buyer market, that actually kind of stayed stable and gradually increased. What I think will happen now is the investor market may pick up, right? And I'm not saying a whole bunch of people will go out and buy homes. I'm just thinking the old default investor, meaning you've got a home and you want to trade up, you want to buy a bigger home, right? And you've got secure jobs. You go out there and you buy your second home, but you do that, but the bank says, you know what, move into your first home and have time to sell. You might find that, repayments are quite cheap. Maybe I don't need to sell this one. And you basically hold on to your original house as a rental investment. So I think that is going to happen a lot more now. Investment market. Now, what does all this mean for pricing? That's another thing I want to get into. So in terms of interest rates, I see, so right now if you had a 19% deposit as opposed to a 20% deposit, your interest rates were quite different. So I see that gap closing. So now what I see is that I think that it's going to be a bit cheaper if you have a 5 to 10% deposit. The other thing I see is that if you do have a 5 to 10% deposit, you're going to be able to have a more secure approval which will last a little bit longer. Right now those approvals are really tight. We've got to kind of reapply for them every 30 days. Some banks will say, hey, find a property first. That's where I see things changing, so it'll be a little bit easier to buy if you have a lower deposit. Remember, these things are not going to change tomorrow. The banks have systems and they're tuned into working in a particular way for the last 4 years. So what you will find is over the next 2-3 weeks, things start to change slowly. But right now, one thing I do know that bankers do remember is if you have a 20% deposit across multiple properties, that's kind of going to be the space where it's fairly easy to say, yep, if that you can borrow, basically. You don't have to worry about 30%. I'm guessing that part will change pretty quickly. So, the other thing I think will change is if you had a 17% deposit or a 15% deposit and you were told, now you really need to get to 20%, I think now you probably should try again because that still shows, some strength as opposed to a 5 or 10% deposit. So anyway, I hope that has been helpful. I know there's a little bit there to digest, but things are going to keep changing. So keep checking with your banker or broker if you haven't been able to do stuff previously. You might be able to do things now. So yeah.